Victoria has held major positions in cybersecurity with Europol, Facebook, and the Serious Organised Crime Agency. And she is currently in position at both Cambridge and Bournemouth universities, but also, thank goodness, at Gresham.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. So I'm going to start with a question. When, in your opinion, was the golden age of communication? In this era of instant messaging and live streaming, it's easy to get caught up in thinking that this is communication's heyday. But communities have always needed to communicate. And as soon as we began to travel and to trade, the distance to be covered by that communication grew. In earlier communities, signals were often simple, easily recognized, and specific to their use cases. In some contexts, sounding an alarm would depend largely on that sound being unexpected or out of the ordinary. So, church bells signalled an emergency if they sounded at the wrong time, not on the quarter hour, or to call to scheduled worship, or if the peal was not one customary for celebrations. Indeed, several sources suggest that peals may have rung out backwards in emergencies. And from this, we can deduce that from our early history, effective messaging and signals have to some extent relied on people being able to recognize patterns and detect anomalies, deviations from the norm. And curiously, pattern recognition and anomaly detection is precisely how we conduct security operations today. In fact, it's how we secure our communications on the internet. The delivery of more complex, audible information over long distances was possible, but not without difficulty. Talking drums were used to imitate the pitch and cadence of African tonal languages. And this appears to have been more effective in ritual settings, where the words of proverbs and songs might already be known and expected, and arguably less so when communicating factual information, where ambiguity could prove problematic, and the transmission of brief, recognized patterns denoting essential messages would have been preferable. But this did not stop talking drums being viewed with suspicion by those who didn't understand their language, and their use was forbidden in the United States in the enslavement era, due to fears that a secret communication channel could be used to incite rebellion. A signal may also be awaited, looked for, and an example of this is, of course, the fumata bianca, the white smoke that announces the successful election of a new pope. Black smoke, on the other hand, fumata nera, signalling that the two-thirds majority of voting cardinals has not yet been reached. Now, smoke signals are, of course, not the preserve of the Vatican. In ancient China, soldiers sent different coloured signals along the Great Wall by adding various herbs to their fires. And in England, in 1588, beacons were lit and configured to convey information about the approach of the Spanish Armada, according to a practice of defensive communication that continued for some centuries. So, a single lit beacon of a group of 3 might indicate a suspect vessel out at sea. 2, a stronger suspicion of enemy approach, and 3, an imminent invasion. There's a modern parallel here too, this time with the public communication of graded national threat levels. So currently, the terrorist threat level in the UK is substantial, meaning that an attack is likely. But levels range from low to critical, which denotes that an attack is highly likely in the near future. But away from urban terrorist targets, 3 fires in a triangle or 3 fires in a series are still an internationally recognized distress signal. So for all that we now have the capability to communicate more complex safety messages, there is still a place for signals that have served us for hundreds of years. In the 2nd century BCE, the Greek historian Polybius described technologies for the telegraphy of more complex messages, including a hydraulic system devised by the 4th century engineer Aeneas Tacticos, of which this is a replica at the Kotsanos Museum of Greek Technology. Now, this enabled the sending of pre-agreed messages such as cavalry arrived in the country, heavy infantry, light-armed infantry, infantry and cavalry, ships, corn, and so on, until, Polybius writes, we have entered in all the sections, the chief contingencies of which, at the present time, there is a reasonable probability in wartime. Now, I like this a lot. In fact, I absolutely love this because it is a great example of how ancient IT gives us an insight into the dominant preoccupations of the day, which, in this case, are imminent invasion and food security. So not much changes. It worked by inscribing identical messages in identical locations on identical rods attached to identical cork floats in 2 identical jars filled with water. So the transmitter signaled to the receiver with a burning torch when to open and close the taps, and when the flow stopped, the desired message was viewed on the receiver's device. Polybius also records a method for encoding letters in fire signals, and he credits what has since become known as the Polybius square to 2 Alexandrian engineers, Cleoxenes and Democritus. It's a matrix which designates the number of torches to be held up in 2 groups of 5, according to the columns and the rows. So alpha is formed by 1 torch in one group and 1 torch in the other, because it's in the first position, both vertically and horizontally, while sigma is formed by, I'll just check I've got my numbers right, 4 torches in one group and 3 in the other, because it's 4 down and 3 across. Humans also bear messages, sometimes quite literally. The 5th century BCE historian Herodotus recounts how, in one of the earliest recorded examples of steganography, the Greek tyrant Histiaeus tattooed a secret message on the shaved head of one of his slaves. Once the hair had grown back, he sent the slave to his son-in-law with instructions on how to read the message, namely, shave his head, which was an order to revolt against the Persians. Reliance on human envoys is of long standing, and although there is a lack of consensus about the precise origin of that well-worn saying, don't kill the messenger, or alternatively, don't shoot the messenger, accounts of violence against envoys for bringing bad news can be found in several traditions. In the Old Testament, David kills a young man who informs him that Saul and Jonathan have died in battle. Plutarch and Appian both describe a scene in which the Armenian king, Tigranes, slaughters a messenger who brings him news of the Roman general Lucullus advancing in 69 BCE. And curiously, they disagree about how he met his end. Plutarch states that Tigranes cut off his head, Appian that he was hanged. And rather astutely, Plutarch presents this execution as a strategic error, which ultimately contributes to the downfall of Tigranes. Plutarch writes, "No one else would tell him anything, and so he sat in ignorance while the fires of war were already blazing around him, giving ear only to those who flattered him." From this story, several key ideas emerge, and the first is that of the message as intelligence, information of importance or added value. Knowledge here is power. New knowledge strengthens what in the world of military strategy is known as the information position. Human envoys and ambassadors both represent and report back, as when Thomas Gresham, in 2 locations here in this hall, undertook quasi-ambassadorial duties for Elizabeth I, also here in the hall. And as the historian John Guy relates in his excellent book and accompanying Gresham lecture, the founder of this college ran a network of informers that stretched from Germany to Spain. And he wrote that it is most convenient for the Queen's Majesty to have daily advertisements, and that with agents like his scattered across Europe, nothing can stir but that Her Highness is assured to have good advertisements. Advertisement here taking its historical meaning of something brought to somebody's attention, rather closer to our modern use of the word intelligence. So it's in this diplomatic context that the prohibition on killing the messenger makes the most sense. It reflects the fact that human messengers were very often not merely postmen, but official representatives of the sender. That modern concept of diplomatic immunity can trace its heritage all the way back to the divine protector of messengers, Hermes in the Greek tradition, Mercury in the Roman. He's often depicted, as here, wearing winged sandals and a winged helmet. And he also holds the caduceus, the staff carried by heralds as a symbol of their authority and inviolability. He comes to be the symbol of messaging, and well into the present day, whether that's in the name of the now defunct British phone company, Mercury Telecoms, the swift messenger of the old BT logo, or, rather optimistically, branded parcel deliveries. As another historic link to this college has noted, the value so often intrinsic to a message requires protection. This is John Wilkins, founding fellow of the Royal Society, Bishop of Chester, and brother-in-law of Oliver Cromwell. And you may remember him from my lecture on the future of technology last year, where we discussed a work in which he imagined a journey to the moon. Wilkins also penned this 1641 work. It's called Mercury, or The Secret and Swift Messenger, showing how a man may, with privacy and speed, communicate his thoughts to a friend at any distance. According to the frontispiece of this first edition, you could buy it at the George, just down the road at the other end of Chancery Lane. Now, as you might imagine, a pub that sells books on encryption is precisely the kind of thing I dream about at night. Now, as we saw in my lecture on encryption, writing a message in code presupposes that there is a risk of that message being intercepted. And that's something we're going to consider in more detail in my lecture on the history of surveillance in a few months' time. All these methods presume human operators. But employment in message carrying is, of course, much more inclusive than that, especially in the pre-industrial era. Horses have been reliable vehicles for messengers and messengers for millennia. And for a brief period, before the mainstream adoption of the electrical telegraph, the Pony Express in the United States formalized this usage into a transcontinental express mail service comprising relays of riders. But I would argue that the most versatile animal in messaging is the carrier pigeon, believed to have been actively engaged in the transport of messages as far back as 14th century BCE Egypt, and confirmed by the elder Pliny to have been so employed in 1st century Rome. In Book 10 of the Natural History, Pliny writes that pigeons have acted as messengers in affairs of importance. During the siege of Mutina, which is 43 BCE, Decimus Brutus, who was in the town, sent dispatches to the camp of the consuls fastened to pigeons' feet. Of what use to Mark Antony then were his entrenchments and all the vigilance of the besieging army, his nets too, which he had spread in the river, while the messenger of the besieged was cleaving the air. Now, this striking description casts the birds as extraordinary instruments of tactical ingenuity, and indeed, their fleetness of wing and reliability assured their place in information technology, at least until the advent of the electric telegraph, and apparently far beyond. A fleet of pigeons was used by the founder of Reuters to carry news where there were gaps in the telegraph network. And it would seem that the advent of the internet was what finally put paid to commercial and official use of carrier pigeons, with one police department in India only discontinuing what it called P-mail in 2008. The pigeons' ability to go where wires could not kept them in business, as did their multimedia capacity. Over the centuries, they've carried not only written messages, but other formats, images, audio tape, and microfilm. And in this respect, they are arguably unsurpassed until the internet age. In the First and Second World Wars, pigeons were deployed extensively by the military. And in the UK, declassified papers reveal that MI14 operated Source Columba, the special pigeon service, which dropped birds into occupied Europe equipped with paper, pencil, message tube, and instructions for completing a report. People completing the report, not the pigeons. But they were effectively operational intelligence gatherers. Now, I've mentioned the military quite a lot, and inevitably, armed forces have been central to signals innovation from its earliest history. Signal instruments, including drums, fifes, and bugles, kept time and issued commands on land and sea. And over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, military communications were institutionalized in countries' signals corps. The electric telegraph and subsequently radio technology were widely used, and field telegraph trains and field radios provided mobile networks long before mobile phones. In the run-up to and during the Second World War, nations invested heavily in experimental technologies like radar. And at its base in Christchurch in Dorset, the British Air Defence Experimental Establishment developed coastal defence radar, later known as Chain Home Low, which was the Royal Air Force's early warning system for detecting and intercepting aircraft. When that agency moved in 1943, the Signals Research and Development Establishment, SDRE, took over the site. SDRE was engaged in cutting-edge development of radio and satellite communications. It built Wireless Set Number 10, which was the world's first multi-channel microwave relay communication system, which was used for secure battlefield communications. It was the forerunner of the ptarmigan system used by the British Army, which itself provided the technology for today's mobile networks. After the end of the war, the unit began to experiment with global radio communication, bouncing radio waves off the moon and off space junk. SDRE was also at the forefront of satellite research, including the Skynet family of satellites, not the ones from Terminator, I promise, which still provide communications for the UK military. And quantum physicists on the site conducted research into the use of fibre optic cables for transmitting large amounts of data, another innovation that is now widespread. Now, I remember these because until 1980, the moon bounce dish and the radomes were clearly visible to residents and holidaymakers, known locally as grockles. Their concrete bases are all that remains today of the incredible technological progress made on this tiny little patch of British seaside. But of course, it is one of just many hundreds, perhaps thousands, of such sites around the world. Radio communication also raised the possibility that mechanical devices could be remotely controlled. And one such idea was the radio-controlled torpedo. But radio communication could be easily jammed, and that thwarted remote guidance. So, in 1941, two US-based inventors filed a patent for a secret communication system, and they described it as follows. They said it involved the use of carrier waves of different frequencies, especially useful in the remote control of dirigible craft such as torpedoes. An object of this invention is to provide a method of secret communication which is relatively simple and reliable in operation, but at the same time is difficult to discover or decipher. Briefly, our system, as adapted for radio control of a remote craft, employs a pair of synchronous records, one at the transmitting station and one at the receiving station, which change the tuning of the transmitting and receiving apparatus from time to time, so that without knowledge of the records, an enemy would be unable to determine at what frequency a controlling impulse would be sent. The two identical sets of instructions would be synchronized with technology repurposed from the entertainment world, namely the paper rolls used in player pianos. The authors of the patent continue. In a conventional player piano record, there may be 88 rows of perforations, and in our system, such a record would permit the use of 88 different carrier frequencies, from one to another of which both the transmitting and the receiving station would be changed at intervals. Furthermore, records of the type described can be made of substantial length and may be driven slow or fast, and this makes it possible for a pair of records, one at the transmitting station and one at the receiving station, to run for a length of time ample for the remote control of a device such as a torpedo. According to one of the patent holders, composer George Antile, the US Navy rejected the idea at the time because they assumed it meant that player pianos would have to be installed on submarines. This was, of course, not the case. But what's now known as frequency hopping or spread spectrum technology was incorporated into US military radio communications in the 1950s, and today it is used to reduce interference in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, and the GSM International Mobile Phone Network. If you saw my previous lecture on the ancient history of computers and code, there may be something familiar about this diagram. It looks rather like the punch cards used to program 19th and 20th century computers, which in turn drew on technology used in jacquard weaving looms. And indeed, they share the same mechanical heritage. The other name on the patent is that of Hedy Keysler-Markey, better known as the actor Hedy Lamarr. Reportedly, the inspiration for Disney's depiction of Snow White, and famously described as the most beautiful woman in film. I don't think I would disagree with that. She was one of the stars, undoubtedly, of the golden age of Hollywood. Before leaving her native Austria for the UK in the early 1930s, she had been married to the country's leading arms manufacturer. And after her arrival in the US, the tycoon and aviator Howard Hughes made his team of scientists available to assist in her inventions. Her concept for a secret communications channel did not go unnoticed at the time. In addition to receiving the official approval of the National Inventors Council on the 1st of October 1941, the New York Times ran a story, albeit in its amusements section, which recognized so vital is her discovery to national defense that government officials will not allow publication of its details. And the article speculated that the only inkling of what it might be was the announcement that it was related to remote control of apparatus employed in warfare. So rather refreshingly, and perhaps unexpectedly, this article doesn't mention her looks, although the use of the term red hot perhaps gives a flavour of that. It does at least purport to be a quote from the National Inventors Council. It also doesn't adopt a condescending tone to the effect that the invention is a good effort for a little lady. Now, Lamarr received no financial compensation for the use of her invention, but interest in her scientific work increased toward the end of her life, apparently prompted, at least in part, by the testimony of an engineer who had worked on a sonar buoy submarine location device for the US Navy. And this was accompanied by official recognition by the US military and an Electronic Frontier Foundation Pioneer Award, jointly received with George Antheil in 1997. Since her death in the year 2000, her status as an unsung hero has continued to grow, almost exponentially. In 2014, she was induced into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, and in 2021, a GPS-3 satellite was named in her honour. The popular belief that she invented Wi-Fi has been propagated by the US National Archives and by many thousands of well-meaning social media users keen to reclaim information technology from Silicon Valley tech bro culture. So in a popular internet meme, images of Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg, and Steve Jobs with the captions, "I made Twitter, I made Facebook, and I made Apple," are juxtaposed with an iconic photograph of Lamarr captioned, "I made Wi-Fi." Rather like Ada Lovelace, whose contribution to computing we considered in the last lecture, she's becoming something of a mythical figure for those seeking to encourage women and girls to participate in IT. But it's clear that Lamarr and Antheil did not invent and could not have invented Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, or any other modern messaging system. Claiming as much is sensational, even while it seeks to redress an imbalance. And I would argue it's counterproductive because it's so easily disproved. The facts of the matter, that she co-invented a technology which enables messaging systems to operate more securely and more efficiently, are extraordinary enough, even if they are less amenable to being turned into sound bites and clickbait. As I've hinted at a number of times already, the advent of the electric telegraph in the 1830s proved hugely disruptive to the existing mechanisms for messaging and signalling, whether these were visual or written, two-legged or four-legged. It made it possible for people to transmit messages across long distances quicker than they ever had before. And in this and other respects, it was, in the words of author and journalist Tom Standage, effectively a Victorian internet. Global adoption of electric telegraphy depended on other inventions, among them the harnessing of electricity, the light bulb, and a language to encode letters as electrical pulses. 1865 saw the introduction of International Morse code, which standardized American and continental European versions, and it resulted in a format that could be used for all languages with Roman letters and Arabic numerals. And just like modern internet traffic, intercontinental telegraphy required the laying of undersea cables, including a 2,500-mile cable across the Atlantic Ocean, which needed to be insulated with gutta-percha. And just as the 21st century has seen a boom in the market for the rare minerals and precious metals used in the production of batteries and mobile phones, the telegraph rush was a fantastic time to be a gutta-percha merchant. It's not easy to say that, a gutta-percha merchant. But then as now, our drive to communicate ever more innovatively and immediately made fortunes for the few at the expense of the masses and also depleted natural resources. Perhaps less well known than the electric telegraph is the system that preceded it, and it's one which has left its mark on the landscape around the world. Invented by Claude Chappe in the early 1790s, the optical telegraph made use of high ground or purpose-built towers, as had earlier visual systems, but also its own language, semaphore. An apparatus with two movable arms attached to pulleys enabled an operator to change positions to correspond to those for 26 letters and 10 numbers. It was in operation from the end of the 18th century across Europe and a number of countries that had been colonized by European powers. And the global distribution of optical telegraphs is still visible in the sheer number of places called Telegraph Hill, among them the hill in San Francisco on which Coit Tower now sits. Optical telegraphy was much hyped and it spread widely. The 1797 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica envisaged that it might hasten something akin to world peace, stating the capitals of distant nations might be united by chains of posts, and the settling of those disputes, which at present take up months or years, might then be accomplished in as many hours. In Napoleonic France, the network comprised over 500 stations, and it was used to convey military orders, but also general news and even national lottery results. In our current age, in which we are understandably exercised by the potential of IT for misuse, we may take heart from the fact that in 1836, two Bordeaux businessmen were caught using Chappe's telegraph system to receive information about Paris stock prices before anyone else, once again demonstrating what increasingly and rather immodestly I am calling Baines' theory, which states, 1, that technology develops rapidly. 2, that some people will always want to break the rules. 3, these people will have an interest in using technology to break the rules, and therefore the urge to misuse technology is inevitable. Another example of this would be the alleged practice of shipwreckers and bootleggers lighting fires to mislead ships onto rocks. Now, those of us who track trends in this kind of misuse regularly complain that the law is slow to catch up with the pace of technological change, that our attempts to regulate and safeguard IT lag behind the ingenuity of criminals. And this certainly seems to have been the case for our semaphore offenders, the Blanc brothers, who, in the absence of legislation criminalising insider trading, were handed only a small fine for corrupting officials. And they went on to enjoy very full careers running gambling establishments, including the casino at Monte Carlo. And in a turn of events that's becoming something of a constant in this lecture series at least, within just a few decades, the optical telegraph was largely superseded by the electric telegraph, and it was consigned to specialist usage. Semaphore, of course, lives on as flag semaphore in the maritime industry, and, as my colleague, the music professor, will tell you, the positions assumed by this little-known 60s beat combo. And as he will also tell you, this doesn't, in fact, spell help at all. It is, consequently, an example of a highly unsatisfactory message. Now, the electric telegraphs devised concurrently by Samuel Morse in the US and Cook and Wheatstone in the UK were not even the first instances of someone conceiving of the idea of using electricity to send messages. The suggestion was made as early as 1753 by Charles Morrison in an anonymised letter to the Scots magazine. Rather than encoding letters as pulses, Morrison proposed that each letter be assigned its own wire. And as early as 1816, a working electrical telegraph had been constructed. In a letter to Lord Melville, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, its inventor, Francis Ronalds, envisaged a future of post-COVID-style hybrid working, writing, "Why should not our kings hold councils at Brighton with their ministers in London? Why should not our government govern at Portsmouth almost as promptly as at Downing Street? Let us have electric conversazione officers communicating with each other all over the kingdom if we can." Well, just over 200 years later, Zoom and Microsoft Teams allow us to do just that, and product names like Office 365 convey the mobile, ubiquitous, virtual environment foreseen by Ronalds. We may, nevertheless, be rather disappointed that the fashion for calling them electric conversazione officers did not catch on. As in other aspects of IT, in the history of messaging and signals, we find thwarted visionaries, but also evidence of digital divides. Use of ancient messaging tools persists where modern equivalents are restricted. In a tale of two neighbouring countries, South Korea's lunar orbiter is at the forefront of demonstrating the feasibility of a pioneering, fault-tolerant space internet. While in North Korea, access to the terrestrial internet is tightly controlled in an effort to throttle communication with outsiders and access to foreign information sources. So in recent years, we've seen campaigns in which activists in the South have launched balloons and bottles to distribute messages on leaflets, USB sticks, and even electronic speakers to the North. This kind of messaging becomes a symbolic act in and of itself. And we're alert to this, aren't we? Because very often, political maneuvers, the mobilization of armies, and even the launching of missiles are interpreted as sending a message. In this context, any object or material can be a message, and the least pleasant of these can be writ large, as in the case of North Korea's recent dropping of bags of rubbish and excrement on the south, or small, when warring villagers post dog dirt through their neighbours' letterboxes, thereby subverting the intended use of messaging infrastructure. In this particular scenario, to coin Marshall McLuhan's overused phrase, the medium really is the message. And it also highlights the capacity of messaging for information warfare. In my lectures here at Gresham, we've talked about this extensively, particularly in relation to fake news, online influence operations, and the Russian concept of desinformatia, disinformation. Airborne propaganda goes back at least as far as the Franco-Prussian War, when a French balloon dropped German messages of defiance on occupying troops. And it was widespread in World War II, when this leaflet, dropped by the Allies and urging Germans to surrender, reached my grandfather in his prisoner of war camp. That it is still prevalent in some parts of the world speaks to the facility for messaging and messengers to revert to tried and tested lower tech methods where higher tech is unavailable. Messaging technologies may likewise take on ritual significance when they are superseded, just as bugles continue to be sounded in the military despite the dominance of digital communication. As the Polybius Square illustrates, and as John Wilkins identified, effective messaging is often not just speedy, but also secure. Governments that want to control the thoughts and speech of their citizens are driven to limit the availability of any technology that can be used to send and receive information in secret. Now, it may be something of a stretch to claim that greater internet surveillance and censorship will lead to a dramatic increase in pigeon fancying, but it does appear to be the case that citizens around the world are becoming more aware of their traceability through digital messaging and signals. So, to return to the exam question, when was the golden age of communication? Well, I think it depends on your perspective. Each generation makes full use of the messaging tools at their disposal for good or, following Baines' theory, for ill. Inventors and innovators built on the dominant networks, systems, and general-purpose technologies of their day. The optical telegraph added complexity to traditional visual signals. The electrical telegraph used a similar method for encoding letters, but to transmit over wires rather than sightlines. The telephone was conceived as a means of sending sound down telegraph wires, radio as wireless telegraph. Some technologies, components, and materials continue to play crucial roles in our communications infrastructure. Those undersea cables are as important to the global internet as they were to the intercontinental telegraph network. Radio waves remain the means of transmission for so much of our communication, whether that's broadcast or two-way. And it's only really with 5G that mobile cell phone communication is moving from radio waves to microwaves. And for the next generation, 6G, researchers are exploring whether visible light can be used for communication in combination with radio technologies, so taking us from Wi-Fi to Li-Fi. So then, what about if we were to choose just one person to whom modern communication owes the most? I'm afraid that also wouldn't be Hedy Lamarr, as much as I would like it to be, but it might well be Guglielmo Marconi, whose research and development formed the basis of all modern wireless communication systems. Having built the first complete radio transmission system in 1895, aged just 21, Marconi arrived in the UK a year later and immediately applied for the very first patent for radio telegraphy. And this attracted the interest of the General Post Office, to whom he demonstrated transmission over land in 1896 and over water in 1897. And this photograph marks the latter occasion. It's Post Office engineers inspecting Marconi's equipment on Flatholm Island in the Bristol Channel. Within 10 years, regular transatlantic wireless communication had been established, and Marconi stations were springing up all over the world. A famous instance of the use of his technology highlights the criticality of his contribution and also the importance of standards for sending signals. When the Titanic hit an iceberg mid-Atlantic on its maiden voyage in 1912, the senior wireless operator issued a distress call that was picked up by another liner, the Carpathia, 60 miles away. When the Carpathia reached the grid reference transmitted by the Titanic, it rescued over 700 survivors, prompting the British Postmaster General, Herbert Samuel, to pronounce, "Those who have been saved through one man, Mr. Marconi, and his marvelous invention." Now, the initial distress signal sent by the Titanic wasn't, in fact, SOS, although this had been designated as the agreed international distress signal in 1906. The senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips, instead sent CQD. That was the Marconi Company's distress signal, and it was based on the practice of using CQ as a prefix for all stations along a telegraph line. After 2 hours sending this signal, the junior operator, Harold Bride, recalls in his memoirs that he half-jokingly suggested, "Send SOS. It's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it." The Carpathia was, in fact, already on its way, but sadly it was indeed Jack Phillips' very last turn on duty. Without Marconi, we also wouldn't have all those wartime innovations, including radar and frequency hopping. Without the electric telegraph, we probably wouldn't have had Marconi. And without the optical telegraph, the electric telegraph might have been very different. These are the technological giants on whose shoulders the almost global internet stands. Some of them have taken a very long time to die. The very last telegram was sent in 2013. The ghosts of others are still with us in the landscape, all those radome bases, those telegraph hills, and those semaphore roads. One wonders whether our descendants will commemorate 5G phone masts in quite the same way. One thing is certain, though. Today's wireless technology, internet traffic, messaging and broadcast apps have not, if you'll please pardon the pun, come out of thin air. It has always been a golden age of communication. A final postscript then on the messengers who have never left our sides or the skies, because I feel it is my duty to inform you that recently there have been 2 major developments in the pigeon world. Firstly, taking inspiration from a satirical conspiracy theory that birds are surveillance drones operated by the US government, and appearing also to draw on the CIA's documented experimental use of pigeons equipped with cameras, it has been suggested that pigeons are no longer real, and specifically that former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher replaced them with robots equipped with recording and transmitting equipment. Yes, I really did just say that in a Gresham lecture. I'm going to leave it to you to use your critical thinking on that one. Meanwhile, more seriously, Scientists from Ohio State University and the University of Iowa have studied how pigeons learn. And they found that they problem solve and they categorize in a way similar to artificial intelligence. Now, the good news is that they seem to be learning a lot more slowly than AI. But that said, you may want to keep them away from your phone, just in case. Thank you very much.